In a moment that sent shockwaves through the international community, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who took the stage at the United Nations and delivered a fierce, unapologetic defense of Israel's ongoing military operations. His words were sharp, uncompromising, and delivered with the unmistakable force of a man who knows the world is watching. As cameras rolled and global leaders listened intently, Netanyahu, who declared that Israel's actions were not just justified but essential for the survival of his nation. He insisted that no amount of pressure, no condemnation from the UN, and no international protests would stop Israel from defending itself. The atmosphere in the hall was tense. Diplomats shifted in their seats, some applauding, others shaking their heads. But one thing was clear, Netanyahu was not backing down. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Please subscribe and like my videos. The Prime Minister's UN speech came at a time when Israel is facing mounting criticism over its recent military campaigns. Civilian casualties in Gaza, strikes on Hezbollah positions in Lebanon, and covert operations targeting Iranian assets in Syria have all been in the headlines. Human rights groups have accused Israel of disproportionate force, while international organizations warn that the escalating violence could spiral into a broader regional war. But Netanyahu, standing tall under the spotlight, rejected those accusations outright. His message was simple but powerful. Israel is under siege, and the nation will do whatever it takes to survive. To understand the gravity of this moment, we need to rewind. Israel's military operations in recent months have been some of the most intense since the 2014 Gaza war. Rocket barrages from Gaza, drone strikes from Hezbollah, and intelligence reports of Iranian weapons smuggling into the region have put Israeli security on high alert. Netanyahu framed his speech not just as a defense of current policies, but as a warning to Israel's enemies. He emphasized that Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran are part of a coordinated network that seeks nothing less than Israel's destruction. For Netanyahu, every strike, every air raid, every operation is a preemptive step against what he calls an existential threat. But this was not merely a speech for domestic politics. This was Netanyahu addressing the world. In a dramatic moment, he held up satellite images of what he claimed were secret Iranian weapons facilities hidden in Syria and Lebanon. He accused Tehran of turning civilian neighborhoods into military bases, using families and children as human shields. His tone was defiant as he asked the international community, "What would you do if rockets were falling on your cities? What would you do if terrorists were at your borders?" The hall was silent, the tension unbearable, as he paused and then declared, "Israel will act, Israel will not apologize, Israel will endure." The reactions were immediate and polarized. American and European allies acknowledged Israel's right to self-defense, but quietly urged restraint behind closed doors. Arab states, already angered by recent Israeli strikes, called the speech inflammatory and accused Netanyahu of justifying collective punishment against Palestinians. Russia and China criticized Israel's military policies, framing them as destabilizing to the entire Middle East. Meanwhile, back in Israel, Netanyahu's supporters hailed him as a strong leader who stood firm against global pressure, while his critics accused him of escalating tensions and isolating the country diplomatically. Netanyahu's choice to confront the world head-on at the UN was not accidental. He has long understood the power of spectacle, the importance of imagery, and the weight of words spoken on the global stage. In the past, he has drawn red lines on Iranian nuclear ambitions with a marker and poster board. This time, his weapon was defiance itself, a rhetorical strike meant to leave no doubt that Israel's security doctrine remains uncompromising. He reminded the assembly of the long history of Jewish persecution, the trauma of the Holocaust, and the promise that Israel would never again be defenseless. Never again, he repeated, his voice rising. For his audience, the historical resonance was unmistakable, yet beneath the powerful rhetoric, the realities of the ground remain grim. Gaza is reeling under relentless bombings, infrastructure is collapsing, and humanitarian agencies are warning of catastrophe. Hezbollah, emboldened by Iranian support, continues to probe Israel's northern borders, launching rockets and drones in an escalating war of attrition. Inside Israel, the population is torn between fear and resilience, with air raid sirens a part of daily life for communities near the borders. Netanyahu framed all of this as part of Israel's struggle for survival, but the international community sees a much more complicated picture, one of disproportionate response, mounting civilian casualties, and the ever-present risk of regional war. What makes Netanyahu, whose speech especially consequential, is the timing. The Middle East is already a tinderbox. Iran has been expanding its influence in Yemen, Syria, and Iraq. Saudi Arabia, once rumored to be on the verge of normalizing ties with Israel, has pulled back amid public outrage over Gaza. The United States, while continuing to supply Israel with weapons, is under growing domestic pressure to reassess its unconditional support. And the UN itself, weary from years of unheeded resolutions, stands as a stage for condemnation more than action. Into this chaos, Netanyahu, who delivered a speech that may harden positions on all sides rather than open paths to peace. For Netanyahu, however, this is not just geopolitics, it is personal. His political career has been defined by his hardline security stance. Facing domestic challenges, corruption trials, and protests against his government's judicial reforms, Netanyahu, who has increasingly leaned on foreign policy and national security to rally support. His appearance at the UN was as much about reassuring Israelis that their leader is standing strong as it was about warning the world. In many ways, this was Netanyahu, who at his most authentic, defiant, unapologetic, and determined to make Israel's voice heard even when the chorus of critics grows louder. The consequences of this speech could be far-reaching. For one, it will likely embolden the Israeli Defense Forces to continue their campaigns with renewed vigor, knowing that the Prime Minister has publicly committed to them on the world stage. Secondly, it may deepen the rift between Israel and much of the international community, particularly humanitarian organizations and nations in the global south. And third, it could escalate tensions with Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas, who may interpret Netanyahu's words not as deterrence, but as provocation. In the Middle East, rhetoric is never just rhetoric. It is often a prelude to action. Already, in the hours after the speech, reports began to surface of intensified Israeli airstrikes on Gaza and new mobilizations along the northern border. Hezbollah issued its own statement, vowing retaliation for what it called Zionist aggression. Iranian state media denounced Netanyahu, who as a war criminal, and accused the UN of providing him a platform to legitimize war. The cycle of speech and counter-speech, action and reaction is well underway. The world watches anxiously as the situation edges closer to the brink. Still, Netanyahu's defenders argue that the harsh reality of Israel's security environment leaves no room for compromise. Surrounded by hostile groups and nations, facing rocket fire and terrorism, and confronting the specter of a nuclear Iran, Israel, they argue, cannot afford weakness. In this view, Netanyahu's speech was not dangerous but necessary, a message to allies and enemies alike that Israel will not bow. It is a world shaped by history, trauma, and an unshakable belief in self-reliance. But critics are equally adamant. They warn that Netanyahu's hardline stance only fuels the cycle of violence, erodes chances for diplomacy, and deepens Israel's isolation. They argue that true security cannot be achieved through force alone, that peace requires compromise, and that the longer military operations continue, the more resentment will grow, feeding the very threats Israel seeks to eliminate. For them, Netanyahu, whose UN speech was not a defense of Israel's survival, but a manifesto for perpetual conflict, the question now is what comes next. Will Netanyahu's speech mark a turning point in Israel's relations with the world, or will it fade into the long history of UN confrontations? Will it strengthen Israel's deterrence, or provoke new attacks from its enemies? Will allies like the United States continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel, or will pressure for accountability force a recalibration? These are questions with no easy answers, and the coming weeks and months may provide grim clarity. As the lights dimmed in the UN hall and Netanyahu, who left the podium, the world was left with a speech that will be studied, debated, and remembered. For some, it was a bold statement of survival and sovereignty. For others, it was a dangerous escalation cloaked in the language of self-defense. But for all, it was undeniable. Netanyahu, who had once again seized the global stage, forcing the world to reckon with Israel's reality, Israel's choices, and Israel's future. In the end, the story of this speech is not just about one leader's words, but about the ongoing clash between security and humanity, between survival and justice, between the state of Israel and the broader Middle East. It is a story that continues to unfold with every airstrike, every rocket launch, and every diplomatic exchange. Netanyahu, whose UN speech may be remembered as a defining moment in this ongoing saga, a moment when Israel stood firm, the world bristled, and the path ahead grew ever more uncertain. This is breaking news, and the situation remains fluid. What is clear, however, is that Netanyahu, whose defiant defense at the UN has set the tone for what comes next, a future filled with tension, risk, and the ever-present shadow of war. And as history has shown time and again, words spoken in that chamber are rarely forgotten. They echo through the corridors of power, across borders, and into the lives of millions caught in the storm. Tonight, the world holds its breath, the Middle East trembles, and Israel, for better or worse, has made its stand.